The officer thought he was pulling over just another car. But in less than 10 minutes, he would realize he had just stopped the one man no one at that base could afford to delay. The red and blue lights sliced through the early morning haze like a warning no one else seemed to hear, reflecting sharply across the glossy black surface of a sedan moving steadily down the quiet two-lane road just outside Maxwell Air Force Base. And inside that car sat Colonel Marcus Ellison, his posture straight, hands resting calmly at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. His eyes focused ahead with the quiet discipline of a man who had spent over 2 decades learning that control was not about force, but about restraint. The dashboard clock read 6:42 a.m. And the meeting he was heading toward was not just important. It was critical. A classified briefing that required his presence and no one else's. Yet, in that moment, none of that mattered to the man stepping out of the patrol vehicle behind him. Officer Travis Cole adjusted his belt as he approached, his boots crunching lightly against the gravel shoulder, his expression already set in a kind of judgment that had nothing to do with traffic violations and everything to do with assumption. He tapped twice against the driver's side window. Sharp, impatient. And when Marcus lowered the glass slowly, the cool morning air slipped between them, carrying a tension that didn't need words to be understood. License and registration, Cole said. His tone clipped, his eyes scanning Marcus, not as a person, but as a question he had already decided the answer to. Marcus nodded once, reaching carefully for his wallet. Movements deliberate. Visible. Respectful. He handed over his documents along with a military ID. The insignia, subtle but unmistakable to anyone who cared to actually look. But Cole barely glanced at it before letting out a quiet scoff. Step out of the vehicle, he said, his hand resting near his sidearm, not in threat but in habit. The kind of habit that had been reinforced by years of unchecked confidence. Marcus paused for just a fraction of a second. Not out of fear, but calculation. Then he complied, opening the door and stepping out onto the asphalt. The morning sun just beginning to rise behind him, casting long shadows that stretched across the empty road. A few passing cars slowed slightly. Drivers curious but silent, watching without intervening. Marcus stood tall, 6 feet 2 inches, composed, his expression neutral but his presence unmistakably grounded. Is there a reason I've been stopped? Officer, he asked, his voice even, controlled, the kind of voice that had given orders in far more intense situations than this. Cole tilted his head slightly, as if amused by the question. You were driving a little too comfortably for this area, he replied, vague, dismissive, his gaze dropping briefly to the ID in his hand before flicking back up. You really expect me to believe this, he added, holding up the military identification between 2 fingers like it was something questionable. Marcus didn't react. Not outwardly, but inside. He felt the familiar weight of a moment he had encountered before. The quiet test of dignity under scrutiny. That identification is valid, Marcus said calmly. And I'm due on base within the next 15 minutes. Cole let out a short laugh, shaking his head. Yeah, I've heard that one before, he said, stepping back slightly, looking at the car. Then, back at Marcus. Mind telling me why someone like you is driving a vehicle like this near a restricted area? The question hung in the air. Not because it needed an answer, but because it revealed everything about the man asking it. Marcus's eyes remained steady, unshaken. Because I belong there. He said simply, no emphasis, no challenge, just truth. But truth, in that moment, wasn't something Cole was interested in. He circled the vehicle slowly, his fingers brushing lightly against the trunk as if searching for something that wasn't there. We're going to take a closer look, he said, more to himself than to Marcus. And as he moved, the faint vibration of a phone buzzed inside the car. The screen lighting up briefly with a name that would have changed everything, had Cole chosen to notice it. But he didn't. Not yet. Because in his mind, the situation was already under control, already understood. And as Marcus stood there on the side of that quiet American road, the sun rising higher behind him, he knew something Officer Cole didn't. That control, real control, doesn't come from a badge. It comes from knowing exactly when the truth is about to walk into the scene and change everything. The silence stretched just long enough to feel intentional as Officer Travis Cole leaned slightly against the rear of the sedan, flipping Marcus Ellison's license between his fingers like it was a piece of evidence waiting to confirm a story he had already written in his head. And Marcus stood exactly where he had been told, feet planted on the shoulder of the road. The faint hum of distant traffic blending with the low mechanical idle of the patrol car, his gaze steady but not confrontational. Because he understood something most people did not in moments like this. That escalation rarely began with action. It began with perception. And right now, perception was the only thing guiding the man in front of him. You said you are heading on to the base, Cole muttered. Almost casually, but there was an edge beneath it. A quiet challenge. What is your business there? Marcus did not hesitate. I am assigned there, he replied, his tone calm, measured. I have clearance. Cole let out a breath that sounded closer to disbelief than consideration, his eyes narrowing slightly as he stepped closer, closing the distance not out of necessity, but out of assertion. You expect me to believe that, he said, holding up the military identification again, this time looking at it a fraction longer. Just enough to recognize the rank insignia, but not enough to respect it. Colonel. Huh, he added, the word carrying a weight that suggested doubt rather than acknowledgement. Marcus remained still, his shoulders relaxed, his hands visible at his sides. Yes, he answered simply, no elaboration, no defense, because he knew that truth did not need decoration. But Cole was not listening for truth. He was listening for confirmation of his own suspicion. And when he did not find it, he created it. Step away from the vehicle, Cole said, his voice firmer now, less casual, more directive. And Marcus complied again, taking 2 measured steps back. the gravel shifting beneath his shoes, the early sunlight catching the edge of his watch, a subtle glint that marked the passing seconds he could not afford to lose. Inside the car, the phone buzzed again. Longer this time. Persistent. The screen lighting up with the same name. General Rebecca Hayes. But from where Cole stood, it was just a flicker of light behind tinted glass. Nothing more. Pop the trunk, Cole instructed, already moving toward the back of the vehicle before Marcus could respond. The click of the remote unlocking it echoed softly. And as the trunk lifted, it revealed a neatly organized interior, a duffel bag, a pressed uniform in a garment case, and a sealed red folder marked clearly but discreetly. Command eyes only. The kind of label that meant nothing to someone who did not understand it, and everything to someone who did. Cole glanced at it, paused for half a second, then dismissed it with a shrug. "What is in the bag?" he asked, gesturing toward the duffel. Marcus answered without hesitation. "Personal items and uniform." Cole nodded slowly, as if considering the answer, but his expression did not change. Because the answer had never been the point. Control was, "Go ahead and open it," he said. And again, Marcus complied, kneeling briefly to unzip the bag, revealing neatly folded clothing. Nothing out of place. Nothing suspicious. Just order. Discipline. Routine. The kind of organization that came from years of habit, years of preparation, in years of understanding that details mattered. Cole watched. Arms crossed now. His posture relaxed in a way that suggested confidence. But beneath it was something else. Something quieter. A refusal to reconsider. A refusal to step back. "You know," Cole began, his voice lowering slightly, as if sharing an observation rather than making an accusation. "A lot of people try to pass through here with stories." Marcus closed the bag slowly, standing back up, meeting Cole's gaze without challenge. "This is not a story," he said, and for a brief moment, something shifted. Not in Cole's expression, but in the space between them. A pause that could have led somewhere different, somewhere better. But it passed, replaced quickly by the familiar rhythm of assumption. "Turn around," Cole said. And this time, there was no pretense of casualness. No attempt to soften the command. It was direct. Final. And Marcus hesitated for the first time. Not out of fear, but because he understood the weight of what that moment represented. Not just for himself, but for the situation unfolding. The road remained quiet. The base entrance visible in the distance. Guards moving in routine patterns, unaware of what was happening just beyond their line of sight. The phone buzzed again inside the car. Unanswered. Persistent. And Marcus exhaled slowly, making a decision that was not about compliance, but about control. He turned, placing his hands calmly behind his back. Not because he had to, but because he chose to. And And in that moment, as Officer Cole stepped closer, convinced he was maintaining order, the truth was already moving, already unfolding, already closing the distance between what was believed and what was real. And neither of them could stop what was about to arrive. The air felt heavier now, not because anything visible had changed, but because something invisible had begun to shift. A quiet pressure building beneath the surface as Colonel Marcus Ellison stood with his hands calmly positioned behind his back. His posture straight, his breathing steady. Every movement controlled with the precision of someone who had spent years mastering not just discipline, but restraint. And Officer Travis Cole, standing just behind him, mistook that stillness for compliance without question, for submission without context, because in his mind, the situation had already settled into something simple, something predictable, something he understood. Yes, a few hundred yards down the road, just beyond the outer gate of Maxwell Air Force Base, a young security specialist named Airman First Class Daniel Ruiz stared at a bank of surveillance monitors, his eyes narrowing as he leaned slightly closer to the screen. One hand hovering near the console, as if unsure whether what he was seeing required action or confirmation. The image was clear, the angle precise. A black sedan pulled over just outside the perimeter. A civilian patrol vehicle parked behind it, and a man standing beside the road with his hands positioned behind him in a posture that immediately triggered recognition. Not of a threat, but of protocol. Ruiz adjusted his headset, replaying the feed by a few seconds. Watching again. Slower this time? Focusing on details that others might miss, the way the man held himself, the stillness, the composure, the unmistakable presence of someone trained far beyond the ordinary. And then his eyes caught something else. Something that made his stomach tighten just slightly. The insignia on the identification that had been briefly visible when the officer lifted it earlier. It was not just any identification. It was a rank that carried weight, authority, responsibility. And it did not align with what was happening on that screen. That cannot be right, Ruiz muttered under his breath, glancing around the control room as if expecting someone else to confirm what he was seeing. But the room remained focused on routine, on checklists, on standard operations. Because nothing about that moment had been flagged yet. Nothing had been escalated. Nothing had been questioned. And that was exactly what made it dangerous. Back on the roadside, Officer Cole stepped slightly to the side, his radio crackling softly with unrelated chatter, his attention divided but not distracted. Because he believed he had control. He always believed that you are making this more complicated than it needs to be, he said, his voice firm but measured, as if offering Marcus a chance to correct something that did not exist. And Marcus did not turn his head, did not shift his stance. He simply spoke forward, his voice low and steady. I have complied with every instruction you have given. And for a moment, just a brief moment, there was silence. The kind that stretches thin before it breaks. But Cole filled it quickly, dismissing it with a slight shake of his head. We will determine that. he replied, his tone final, as if the conclusion had already been reached. Inside the vehicle, the phone buzzed again. Longer now. More insistent. The name on the screen unchanged. General Rebecca Hayes. The call unanswered. The time continuing to move forward without pause. Without hesitation. And back in the control room, Ruiz made a decision that would shift everything. He reached for the secure line, his fingers hesitating for only a fraction of a second before dialing, because there were moments in protocol where hesitation cost more than action. And this felt like one of them. Comment? This is perimeter surveillance, he said, his voice controlled but carrying a note of urgency that was difficult to mask. I need confirmation on a personnel identification. Possible mismatch at Checkpoint 3 access road. There was a pause on the other end. Brief, but noticeable. Followed by a response that was sharper, more alert. Send the feed. Ruiz complied immediately. Transmitting the footage, his eyes returning to the screen, as if watching it again might change what he already knew. But it did not. It only reinforced it. The posture, the composure, the insignia. And then the response came back. Different this time. Not routine. Not casual. But precise. Stand by. And the line went quiet. Back on the roadside, Marcus could feel the shift even before it became visible. Not in the officer beside him, but in the environment around them. The subtle change in rhythm. The distant movement near the base gate. The way attention begins to turn before action follows. And he remained still. Because he understood something that Officer Cole did not. That control is not always about what you do in the moment. Sometimes it is about what you allow the moment to reveal. And as the morning sun climbed higher, casting clearer light across the road, across the vehicles, across the two men standing at the center of a misunderstanding that was no longer contained, the truth was no longer waiting quietly. It was already on its way. And when it arrived, it would not need to raise its voice to be heard. Back inside the command building, the shift from routine to urgency was no longer subtle. It was unmistakable. The kind of shift that did not need to be announced because everyone in the room could feel it. Voices lowered, without being told. Movements became sharper, more intentional, and Airman First Class Daniel Ruiz remained fixed in front of the monitor. His eyes locked on the live feed as the confirmation came through the secure line. That individual is Colonel Marcus Ellison. The voice said, clear and controlled, repeat, Colonel Ellison. And this time Ruiz did not hesitate, his posture straightening immediately as he flagged the feed for priority escalation. Because what had been a question seconds ago was now a situation, and situations like this did not wait. Down the hall, a door opened with purpose, and General Rebecca Hayes stepped out, her presence shifting the atmosphere without a single raised word. Conversations softened, eyes turned, because authority, real authority, does not announce itself. It is recognized, "What do we have?" she asked. Her tone even, but precise, and Ruiz turned slightly. "Ma'am, Colonel Ellison has been stopped just outside the perimeter. Identification presented, but not recognized." There was no confusion in her expression, only calculation. A quick alignment of facts, timing, and consequence. "Patch me through," she said, already moving, her hand reaching for the comm unit before the order had fully settled. Back on the roadside, Officer Travis Cole shifted his stance slightly, his earlier certainty beginning to thin. Not yet replaced, but no longer absolute. The quiet hum of the patrol car filled the space between him and Marcus Ellison, who remained still, composed, his posture unchanged. Not because nothing was happening, but because he understood something Cole did not. The control is not always about action. Sometimes it is about waiting, and then the radio crackled. Sharper this time, cutting clean through the silence. "Unit on Perimeter Road. Stand by for command communication." The voice said. Official, unmistakable. And Cole reached for it. His response immediate, but now edged with something new. "This is Officer Cole," he said. And there was a pause, just long enough to shift the air around them. And then her voice came through. Calm, measured, carrying weight without force. "Officer, this is General Rebecca Hayes, Base Commander." And, for the first time since the stop began, the dynamic changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. Cole straightened without thinking, his grip tightening slightly on the radio. "Yes, ma'am," he said. And behind him, just beyond the distant gate, movement began to change. Security personnel adjusting their positions, attention redirecting. Because the moment had extended beyond the roadside, it had been seen, recognized, and now it was being answered. And Marcus Ellison did not move, did not speak, because he did not need to. The truth had already entered the scene, and it did not require his voice to be heard. The weight of the moment settled fully as General Hayes continued, her voice steady, precise. "Officer, confirm the identity of the individual you have detained." And Cole glanced down at the identification still in his hand. The same card he had questioned minutes ago. Now, carrying a clarity he could not ignore. The individual presented identification as Colonel Marcus Ellison. He said, slower this time, more careful. And there was no pause before her response. "That identification is accurate," she said. And the space between those words and the reality in front of him closed instantly. Not with force, but with certainty. "Colonel Ellison is scheduled for a classified briefing that has already begun, and your actions have delayed that process," she continued, her tone unchanged. Not raised, not accusatory, but firm in a way that did not allow misinterpretation. And Cole felt it, not as pressure from her voice, but from the shift happening around him. The distant gate now more active. A military vehicle repositioning. Personnel watching more closely. The environment itself responding to a truth he had not recognized. "Mom, I was conducting a standard stop," he began, but even as he said it, the words felt smaller than they had moments ago. Less certain. Less complete. And Hayes allowed the explanation to exist without interruption before responding. "Procedure requires evaluation," she said, "but it also requires recognition." And that word landed heavier than anything else, because it pointed directly to what had been missed. Not the action, but the understanding behind it. There was a brief silence. And in that silence, Cole's perspective shifted fully. The earlier confidence replaced by clarity. "You are to release Colonel Ellison immediately and return all documentation," she said. The instruction direct. Final. And this time, Cole did not hesitate. "Yes, Mom," he replied, stepping forward, his movements slower now, more deliberate. "Colonel," he said, the title coming carefully, no longer questioned. "You are free to go." And Marcus turned, bringing his hands forward with the same calm precision he had maintained throughout. His expression unchanged. Not because the moment had no meaning, but because it had already revealed everything it needed to. Cole extended the identification back, and Marcus accepted it without comment, placing it away with quiet efficiency. The phone inside the car buzzed again, and this time Marcus answered. "Ellison," he said, and Hayes's voice came through once more. Now, direct. Immediate. Proceed to base. "Colonel," she said, "we will handle the rest." Marcus glanced briefly at Cole. Not with anger, not with judgment, but with something quieter. Something that carried more weight than either. Recognition. And then he stepped back into the vehicle. The engine steady. The road ahead clear. And as he pulled away toward the base, the space he left behind did not return to what it had been. Because something had changed. Not just in position, but in understanding. And Officer Travis Cole stood there for a moment longer than necessary. The radio still in his hand. The silence now different. Because this time, it carried the unmistakable presence of truth and the quiet realization of what it meant. The sedan moved forward with a quiet authority that matched the man behind the wheel, tires rolling smoothly over the asphalt as Colonel Marcus Ellison approached the outer gate of Maxwell Air Force Base. And this time, there was no hesitation, no questioning glance, no delay. The guards at the checkpoint had already been alerted, their posture shifting the moment the vehicle came into view, one of them stepping forward with a crisp, practiced motion, his hand raised not to stop, but to guide. "Good morning, Colonel," he said, his tone respectful, precise. And the gate began to lift before the car had fully come to a stop. Marcus nodded once in acknowledgement, not slowing more than necessary, because time, even now, mattered. The clock on the dashboard now read 6:58 a.m., 2 minutes before the briefing was scheduled to begin. And as he passed through the gate, the world outside seemed to fall away, replaced by the structured rhythm of the base, vehicles moving with purpose, personnel walking with direction, everything aligned to function, to respond, to execute, and Marcus fit into that rhythm without disruption, because it was the world he had earned his place in. The command building stood ahead, its clean lines and quiet presence reflecting the discipline within. And as he parked, the engine shutting off with a soft click, it took a brief moment, just one breath, not to recover, but to reset, because what had happened on that road did not follow him inside. It stayed where it belonged, outside the gate, outside the mission. He stepped out, adjusting his jacket slightly, his movements efficient, composed. And as he entered the building, the environment responded, not with noise, but with recognition, personnel straightening slightly as he passed. Subtle nods exchanged, the quiet language of respect that did not need to be spoken aloud. Inside the operations room, General Rebecca Hayes stood at the head of a long table, a series of digital displays casting a soft glow across the room. Officers seated, documents prepared, the atmosphere focused, ready. And when Marcus entered, there was no announcement, no pause, just a slight shift as Hayes turned her head, meeting his eyes for a fraction of a second, enough to acknowledge both his arrival and the reason for his delay. "Colonel Ellison," she said, her voice steady. "We will proceed." And just like that, the moment outside ceased to exist in this space, replaced entirely by the task at hand. Marcus took his seat, opening the red folder he had carried with him. Its contents precise, critical, the kind of information that required clarity, not distraction. And as the briefing began, his voice was calm, direct, focused entirely on the mission, because that is what defined him. Not the interruption, not the misunderstanding, but the responsibility he carried back outside the base. However, the stillness that had settled around Officer Travis Cole had not moved on so easily. He remained beside his patrol vehicle, the radio now silent, the road returning to its earlier quiet, but it no longer felt the same. The certainty that had guided his actions had been replaced by something else. Something less comfortable, less defined. He walked slowly back toward his car, his steps measured, not rushed, because there was nowhere else he needed to be in that moment except with his own thoughts. He opened the door, sitting down behind the wheel, the interior suddenly feeling smaller than before, more confined, and he looked down at his hands, the same hands that had held that identification, the same hands that had dismissed it. And for the first time, he replayed the moment not from his perspective. but from what it actually was, the details aligning differently now. The insignia, the composure, the responses, all of it forming a picture he had not allowed himself to see earlier. His radio crackled again, breaking the silence. Officer Cole returned to station for report. The voice said, "Neutral, procedural," but carrying an implication that did not need to be explained. He reached for the radio slowly, pressing the button. "Toppe," he responded, his voice quieter than before. Not weakened, but changed. Because something had shifted. Not in the road, not in the system, but in him. He started the engine, pulling back onto the road. The same path he had taken countless times, but it did not feel routine anymore. It felt different, heavier, because now he understood something he had not before. That authority is not proven by control. It is revealed by recognition, and the moment he had failed to recognize, the moment he had overlooked, was not just about one man on the side of the road. It was about something deeper, something that would not be resolved with a single report or a single explanation. And as he drove away, the morning sun, fully risen now, casting clear light across everything it touched. There was no shadow left to hide behind, only the truth of what had happened, and the quiet realization of what it meant. Inside the operations room, the briefing continued with a steady, focused intensity that left no room for distraction. Digital maps shifting across large screens, data points updating in real time, and voices speaking in measured tones that reflected both urgency and control. And Colonel Marcus Ellison stood at the center of it all, his presence calm but commanding, guiding the discussion with precision as he outlined key developments, his voice even, his words clear. Because in this space, clarity was not just important, it was essential. Every second counted. Every decision carried weight, and the officers around the table responded accordingly, taking notes, asking direct questions, adjusting their understanding in real time. And General Rebecca Hayes observed quietly, her gaze moving between the displays and the people in the room, her expression composed, but her awareness sharp. Because while the mission in front of them demanded full attention, the event that had delayed its start had not been forgotten. It had simply been set aside, temporarily, to be addressed when the moment allowed. And now, as the final segment of the briefing concluded, the room began to shift. Not in chaos, but in transition. Chairs moving back, documents being gathered, instructions being confirmed. The structured rhythm of military operations carrying forward without hesitation, and Hayes stepped slightly to the side, her voice low but direct as she addressed Marcus. "Colonel, un moment," she said, and he nodded once, closing the folder in front of him with a quiet finality. The red cover resting flat against the table, its contents now set into motion beyond the room. They moved toward a quieter section of the building, away from the main operations floor. where the noise softened and the pace slowed just enough to allow conversation without interruption. Hayes did not speak immediately. She allowed the silence to settle first. Not as hesitation, but as space, the kind that gives weight to what comes next. "You were stopped for approximately 18 minutes, she said finally, her tone neutral. Factuel, not accusatory. Marcus nodded. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, and there was no frustration in his voice. No lingering tension. Just acknowledgement. Because for him, the moment had already passed. It had served its purpose, revealed what it needed to reveal. Hayes studied him briefly, not questioning his composure, but recognizing it. "You handled it with discipline," she said. And while the words were simple, they carried recognition, the kind that mattered more than any immediate reaction could have. "Marcus met haar gaze. Steady. I followed protocol," he answered. And that answer, too, was simple. But it held something deeper. Something that extended beyond the moment on the roadside. Beyond the delay. Beyond the misunderstanding. Because protocol, in its truest form, was not just about rules. It was about restraint. About knowing when to act and when to allow the situation to reveal itself. Hayes nodded once, as if confirming something she already understood. "There will be a formal review," she said. Not as a warning, but as a statement of process. "The footage has been secured, and the report will be filed through both channels." Marcus did not react outwardly. He simply listened, because he knew that accountability, when it came, did not need to be forced. It moved on its own, guided by systems that existed for that exact reason. "Understood," he said, and Hayes allowed a brief pause before continuing. "This is not just about one stop," she added, her voice still calm, but now carrying a slightly different weight. "It is about recognition, and the absence of it." And for a moment, the conversation shifted from the specific to the broader, from the event to its meaning. Marcus considered her words, not as a reflection of himself, but as a reflection of something larger, something that extended beyond that road, beyond that morning. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly, because there was nothing else that needed to be added. The truth of it did not require elaboration. Hayes straightened slightly. The moment of reflection closing as naturally as it had opened. "You are dismissed," she said, returning to the structure of command. And Marcus nodded once more, turning to leave. His steps measured, his posture unchanged. Because for him, the day continued. The mission remained, and the moment behind him was not something he carried forward. It was something he left exactly where it belonged. Back on that road, where a different kind of lesson had begun to take shape. And miles away, Officer Travis Cole sat in a small, quiet office inside the station. A blank report form open in front of him, the cursor blinking steadily on the screen. Waiting. And for the first time that morning, he was not reacting. He was reflecting, the events replaying in his mind not as they had felt, but as they had been. Each detail clearer now, each assumption more visible. And as he began to type, slowly, deliberately, the words came differently than they might have before. Not defensive, not dismissive, but accurate, because something had changed. Not in the system around him, but in the way he saw it. And that change, quiet as it was, carried more weight than anything that had been said on that road. Because sometimes the most important shift does not happen in the moment of conflict. It happens in the moment after, when the noise has faded, and all that remains is the truth. The cursor blinked steadily on Officer Travis Cole's screen, a small, rhythmic pulse that seemed louder than it should have been in the quiet office. And for a moment he just stared at it, his fingers resting on the keyboard without moving. Because the report in front of him was no longer just a form to complete. It had become something else, something heavier, something that required more than routine language and standard phrasing. He leaned back slightly in his chair, exhaling slowly as he ran through the sequence again. Not the version he had told himself in the moment, but the one that had unfolded in reality. The posture of the man he had stopped, the calm responses, the identification he had dismissed too quickly, and the voice on the radio that had changed everything without raising its volume. He looked down at his hands again, then back at the screen, and finally began to type, each word deliberate, measured, as if accuracy now mattered more than anything else. Because it did. The station around him moved on as usual. Phones ringing in the distance. Footsteps passing by the hallway. Conversations happening just outside the door. But none of it reached him in the same way. Because his focus had narrowed, not on the task, but on the meaning behind it. Across town, inside the command building, Colonel Marcus Ellison stepped out of a secondary briefing room. The weight of the mission now fully transferred into execution. Officers already moving to carry out the directives discussed, and he walked with the same composed pace he had carried all morning. His presence steady, unaffected by the earlier delay. Because for him, the measure of the day was not defined by interruption, but by completion. And as he moved down the corridor, a junior officer paused briefly, offering a respectful nod. "Sir," he said quietly, and Marcus returned the acknowledgement with a simple glance. Because respect, in this environment, was not performative. It was understood. It was consistent. And it was earned. Further down the hall, General Rebecca Hayes stood near a window overlooking the base, her hands loosely folded behind her back, her gaze directed outward, but her attention focused inward on the sequence of events that had unfolded just beyond the perimeter. She had already initiated the formal channels, the review process in motion, the footage secured, the reports aligned. But what remained was not just procedural. It was reflective. Because situations like this were not isolated. They were indicators, signals of something that required attention beyond the immediate. She turned slightly as Marcus approached. Her expression composed but thoughtful. "The situation has been forwarded to the appropriate offices," she said, her tone steady. "Not as a conclusion, but as a continuation." Marcus nodded once. "Understood," he replied, and there was a brief silence. Not uncomfortable, but intentional. The kind that allows understanding to settle without forcing it. "You did not escalate," Hayes added, her voice carrying a quiet emphasis. And Marcus met her Gaze. "There was no need to," he said, and that answer, simple as it was, held a depth that did not require explanation. Because escalation, in the absence of clarity, often creates more than it resolves. Hayes nodded slightly, acknowledging not just the response, but the reasoning behind it. Back at the station, Cole paused his typing again, his eyes scanning the lines he had written so far. And he noticed something that surprised him. The absence of certainty in his own words. Not because the facts were unclear, but because his interpretation of them had changed. And that change was reflected in the language, in the way he described the interaction, in the way he acknowledged what he had overlooked. He adjusted his posture, leaning forward again, continuing to type, not to finish quickly, but to finish correctly, because for the first time, the report was not just documentation, it was accountability. And that distinction mattered. Outside, the morning had fully settled into its rhythm. Traffic flowing steadily. The sun high enough now to cast clear, even light across the roads and buildings. And the place where the stop had occurred looked no different than it had before. No markers, no signs, nothing to indicate what had happened there. But for those involved, the moment remained not as an event, but as a turning point. Subtle, quiet, but undeniable. And inside the command building, Marcus Ellison continued forward, the rest of his day unfolding with the same precision and purpose that had defined his career. Because for him, the lesson was not something to carry. It was something to understand. And understanding, once reached, does not need to be repeated. It simply becomes part of how you move forward. And miles away, in a small office with a blinking cursor and a report taking shape, another kind of understanding was beginning to form. Slower, less certain, but no less important. Because sometimes the most significant change does not happen in the moment of correction. It happens in the quiet space afterward, where truth is no longer something to react to, but something to accept. The report was nearly complete. But Officer Travis Cole did not press submit. Not yet. Because something in him resisted the idea of closing the moment so quickly. As if finalizing the document would also finalize his understanding. And he was not certain he was ready for that. He leaned back again, eyes drifting from the screen to the window across the small office, where the morning had fully taken shape. Sunlight reflecting off parked vehicles, officers moving in and out of the station with the same rhythm that had always defined the place. Nothing outwardly different, nothing visibly changed. And yet for him, everything felt slightly off. Not broken, not chaotic, just misaligned in a way he could not ignore. He turned back to the screen, reading through the lines again, noticing how the words now carried a different tone than anything he had written before. Not defensive, not simplified, but exact. Each detail placed carefully, each action described without assumption. And in that precision, he saw something else, something that had not been there earlier. The gap between what he had believed and what had actually occurred. And that gap, once seen, could not be unseen. Across the base, Colonel Marcus Ellison stood on an elevated platform overlooking a secondary operations area. The briefing now fully transitioned into execution, teams moving with coordination, instructions being carried out with quiet efficiency. And he observed without interruption, his role no longer to direct every movement, but to ensure alignment, because leadership at that level was not about constant presence. It was about trust. Trust in the system, trust in the people, trust in the preparation that had brought them to this point. And as he watched, there was no trace of the earlier delay in his demeanor, no lingering frustration, no need to revisit the moment, because for him, it had already been processed, understood, and placed where it belonged. Outside the scope of what mattered now, back at the station, the door to Cole's office opened slightly. A knock following a second later, and Sergeant Daniel Brooks stepped in, his expression neutral but attentive. "You have been called in for a review meeting," he said, his tone professional, not accusatory, just informative. Cole nodded once. Not surprised, not defensive, just acknowledging what he had expected. When he asked, and Brooks glanced at his watch briefly. 10 minutes, he replied, then paused for a moment, his eyes settling on the screen in front of Cole. "Finish the report," he added, not as an order, but as a reminder. And then he stepped back out, closing the door quietly behind him. Cole turned back to the screen, the blinking cursor now near the end of the document, waiting, and he placed his hands on the keyboard once more, typing the final lines with the same care he had given the rest. Because now, more than before, he understood that accuracy was not just about detail, it was about accountability. And accountability was not something that could be avoided by language. It was something that had to be met directly. He finished the last sentence, paused, then saved the report, but still did not submit it. Not immediately. Instead, he read it one more time, slowly, as if making sure that what he had written reflected not just the sequence of events, but the truth behind them. And only then did he move the cursor to the submit button, hesitating for just a second before clicking it. The screen updating instantly. The report, now part of a system that would move forward, without him. Because that is how systems work. They process, they evaluate, they respond, and they do so based on what is given to them. And for the first time, Cole felt that what he had given was not just information, but honesty. Outside the office, the station continued as it always had. Officers moving with purpose. Conversations overlapping. The steady rhythm of a place that does not pause for individual moments, but absorbs them into a larger flow. And as Cole stood up from his chair, adjusting his uniform slightly, he felt a shift. Not a dramatic one. Not something visible, but something internal. Something that had begun earlier on that road and had now reached a point of recognition. He stepped out into the hallway. The noise returning. The movement continuing. And he walked toward the meeting room with a pace that was neither rushed nor delayed. Because this was not about urgency. It was about understanding. And inside the command building, Marcus Ellison turned away from the operations floor. The work now in motion. The outcome no longer dependent on a single moment. And as he moved down the corridor, his reflection briefly caught in the glass of a nearby window. Steady. Composed. Unchanged. Because the measure of who he was had never been defined by how others saw him, but by how he carried himself regardless of that perception. And that consistency, quiet as it was, remained the strongest form of authority. One that did not need to be proven, only maintained, and miles away, in a meeting that had yet to begin. Another kind of authority was about to be examined, not through power, but through perspective. Because sometimes the most important question is not what happened, but why it was seen the way it was. And once that question is asked honestly, the answer has a way of reshaping everything that follows. The meeting room felt quieter than the rest of the station. Not because it was empty, but because the kind of conversations that happened inside it carried a different weight. One that did not rely on volume to be understood. And Officer Travis Cole stepped in with a controlled pace. His posture straight. His expression neutral, but his awareness sharpened by everything that had led him here. The long rectangular table was already occupied. Sergeant Daniel Brooks seated to one side. A department lieutenant across from him. And a civilian review officer positioned near the end. A folder open in front of her. Its contents neatly organized. Deliberate. Precisi. And as Cole took his seat, there was no immediate questioning. No rapid exchange. Just a brief moment where the room settled around his presence. Allowing the purpose of the meeting to establish itself without announcement, Officer Cole, the lieutenant, began. His tone steady, professional. We are here to review the traffic stop conducted this morning on the perimeter access road. And the words were simple. Factual, but they carried the full context of what that stop had become. Not just an interaction, but a point of examination. Cole nodded once, his hands resting lightly on the table. Yes, sir, he replied, and there was no resistance in his voice. No attempt to preempt the conversation, because he understood now that this was not a moment to defend instinct. It was a moment to understand it. The civilian review officer glanced down at the report, then back up at him, her gaze calm but direct. "We have reviewed your submitted statement," she said, "and we will also be referencing the body camera footage during this discussion." Cole felt the words settle, not as pressure, but as confirmation, because the footage, like the report, would not rely on interpretation. It would present what had happened as it was, and that, more than anything, required clarity. "Before we proceed," Brooks added, his voice measured, "we want to give you the opportunity to walk us through your decision-making process during the stop." And for a moment, Cole considered the question, not because he did not know the answer, but because the answer now carried a different meaning than it had earlier. He took a steady breath, then began, "I initiated the stop based on what I perceived as irregular movement near a restricted area," he said, his tone even, but his words chosen more carefully than before. "I requested identification, which was provided, but I did not immediately recognize its validity." There was a brief pause as he continued, his eyes steady, not avoiding, not deflecting. "I proceeded under the assumption that further verification was required, and the room remained quiet, not interrupting, allowing the explanation to unfold fully, because understanding requires space. And space, in moments like this, is intentional." The lieutenant leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped. "At what point did you consider the possibility that the identification was accurate?" he asked. And the question was not confrontational. It was precise, aimed not at the action, but at the awareness behind it. Cole did not answer immediately, because the truth of it was not immediate. It was gradual. It had developed over the course of the interaction, and he understood that now, "I did not fully consider it until command communication confirmed it," he admitted, his voice steady, but carrying a weight that had not been there earlier. And that admission shifted something in the room, not dramatically, but perceptibly, because it marked a moment of recognition. The review officer nodded slightly, making a note. And prior to that confirmation, she continued, "What influenced your assessment of the situation?" The question lingered. Not because it was difficult to understand, but because it required something deeper than description. It required reflection. And Cole felt that he felt the gap between what he had seen and what had been real. And for the first time, he did not try to close that gap with explanation. He acknowledged it. "My assessment was influenced by assumption," he said, the word clear, unambiguous. And the room remained still for a moment longer than before, because that word carried more than any detailed explanation could have. It pointed directly to the core of what had occurred. Not the stop itself, but the lens through which it had been viewed. Brooks exchanged a brief glance with the lieutenant, not of surprise, but of understanding, because that level of acknowledgement changes the direction of a conversation It moves it from correction to comprehension. Assumption can be subtle, the lieutenant said, his tone measured, but its impact is not, and Cole nodded slightly. Not in agreement with the statement, but in recognition of its truth, because now, more than before, he understood that what had happened was not just a procedural error, it was a moment shaped by perception. And perception, once examined, reveals more than action alone ever could. Outside the room, the station continued its steady rhythm, unaffected by the discussion taking place within. Because systems do not pause for reflection, individuals do. And inside that room, reflection was no longer optional. It was necessary. Because the purpose of the meeting was not just to determine what had happened, but to ensure that what had been revealed did not go unexamined. And as the conversation moved forward, the focus shifted, not away from accountability, but toward understanding how it could be carried forward, how it could shape the way decisions were made in the future. Because, in the end, authority is not defined by the power to act. It is defined by the ability to recognize when action must be guided by something more than assumption, something clearer, something truer, and in that moment, that understanding was beginning to take form, the room did not rush to fill the silence that followed, because what had been said did not require immediate response. It required weight, and that weight settled across the table in a way that shifted the tone of the meeting from review to realization. Officer Travis Cole sat still, his hands no longer moving, his posture no longer guarded, because the word he had chosen had already changed the direction of the conversation. Assumption, it was simple, but it was exact. And the lieutenant leaned back slightly, studying him with a measured gaze that was not searching for fault, but for understanding. "Walk us through that," he said, his voice calm. "Deliberate." Not the action, but the moment before it. And Cole felt the distinction immediately. Because this was no longer about what he did. It was about why he believed it needed to be done. He drew a breath slowly, his eyes lowering for a second, as if tracing the memory back to its beginning. "I saw a vehicle near the access road," he began, "and I made a judgment about it before I had all the information." His voice did not waver, but it carried something different now. Something grounded in reflection rather than reaction. "I believed I understood the situation, and I acted based on that belief." The civilian review officer nodded slightly, her pen moving across the page, not to record something new, but to reinforce what had been clarified. "And when the information you received did not match that belief," she asked, her tone even, leaving space for the answer to settle fully. Cole paused again, but this time the pause was shorter, more certain, because the answer had already taken shape in his mind. "I questioned the information instead of the belief," he said, and that distinction, quiet as it was, shifted something in the room more than any detailed explanation could have, because it revealed not just an action, but a pattern, a moment where perception had overridden verification, And the lieutenant nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. That is where accountability begins. He said, not as a conclusion, but as a marker, a point in the conversation where understanding starts to move forward, not in what you did, but in how you arrived there. Cole listened, not defensively, not passively, but attentively, because for the first time, the conversation was not something happening to him. It was something he was part of, something he could learn from, and that changed the way he heard every word. Sergeant Brooks leaned slightly forward, his tone steady. You followed procedure in parts, he said, but procedure without awareness can still lead to the wrong outcome. And Cole nodded, not because he was agreeing in the moment, but because he recognized the truth in it. Because now he could see the gap, the space between action and awareness that had shaped everything that followed. Yes, sir, he replied quietly. And the room held that acknowledgement without pushing it further. Because recognition, once reached, does not need to be forced. It settles on its own. The review officer closed the folder gently, not as an ending, but as a transition. The footage supports your statement, she said, her tone professional, but carrying a note of clarity. There was no escalation, no violation of conduct standards, but there was a failure in recognition, and the phrase lingered, not as an accusation, but as a definition, something precise enough to be addressed, and Cole absorbed it without resistance, because he understood now that recognition was not optional. It was essential. It was the line between assumption and understanding. And that line had not been clear to him before. The lieutenant straightened slightly, bringing the conversation toward its next phase. There will be follow-up, he said. Training, review, and evaluation. Not as punishment, but as correction, and the distinction mattered because correction is not about consequence. It is about change. And change requires awareness first. Cole met his gaze. Steady. Understood, he said. And there was no hesitation in his voice this time. No uncertainty. Just acceptance. Because the moment on the road had already begun that process. And this conversation was simply continuing it. Outside the room, the station moved forward, as it always did. The rhythm unchanged. The flow uninterrupted. But inside, something had shifted. Not in structure, not in policy, but in perspective. And that shift, quiet as it was, carried more impact than any immediate action could have. Because it would not end when the meeting did. It would carry forward into the next decision, the next moment, the next time perception met reality. And across the base, Colonel Marcus Ellison stood once more near the operations floor, observing the progress of the mission. His posture unchanged, his focus steady, because for him, the day had continued without disruption. The earlier moment already placed behind him. not ignored, but understood. And understanding, once reached, does not need to be revisited. It becomes part of how you move, how you decide, how you lead. And as he watched the teams carry out their assignments, there was no need to reflect on what had happened outside the gate, because the lesson it carried was not his to hold. It was his to demonstrate through consistency, through discipline, through the quiet authority that does not demand recognition, but earns it. And miles away, in a room where a different kind of authority had been examined, that same lesson had begun to take root, not through force, not through consequence, but through clarity. Because sometimes the most powerful change does not come from being told what is right. It comes from finally seeing what was wrong. And choosing to understand it, the meeting did not end with raised voices or dramatic conclusions. It ended with something quieter, something more lasting. A shift in understanding that settled into the room long after the final words were spoken. And, as Officer Travis Cole stepped out into the hallway, the noise of the station returning around him, it did not feel the same as it had earlier that morning. Not because anything had changed externally, but because his perspective had, and that change altered everything he noticed. The way conversations sounded, the way movements carried meaning, the way small details that once seemed routine now held weight. He walked slowly past the front desk, past officers exchanging updates, past the steady rhythm of a place that continued forward without pause. And for the first time, he was not moving through it on instinct alone. He was aware of it, fully, deliberately, and that awareness stayed with him as he stepped outside. The sunlight bright and clear, the air warmer now, the day fully formed. Across the city, at the base, Colonel Marcus Ellison stood once more at the edge of the operations floor. The mission advancing exactly as planned, teams coordinating with precision, information flowing seamlessly from one point to another, and he observed with a calm focus that did not demand attention but naturally commanded it. Because leadership, at its core, is not about presence alone. It is about consistency, about the quiet assurance that the system will hold because it has been built to hold. And as he watched, there was no sign of the earlier delay in his demeanor. No indication that anything had interrupted his path, because for him, the measure of the day had never been the obstacle. It had always been the outcome, and that outcome was now unfolding exactly as it should. General Rebecca Hayes approached from behind, her steps steady, her presence composed. "The review has been initiated," she said, her voice low but clear. And Marcus nodded once. "Understood," he replied, and there was no further discussion needed, because both of them understood that accountability, when handled correctly, does not require constant attention. It requires structure, and that structure was already in motion. Hayes looked out across the operations floor for a moment, then back toward Marcus. "Moments like that," she said, "they reveal more than reports ever can." And Marcus considered her words briefly before responding, They show what is already there, he said. And that distinction mattered, because what had happened that morning was not created in that moment. It had been revealed by it, and once revealed, it could not be unseen. Back at the station, Cole stood near his patrol car, the same one he had driven earlier, the same one that had been part of the moment he now understood differently. And he looked at it for a second, longer than necessary. Not with regret, not with hesitation, but with recognition, because the tool had not changed. The system had not changed. But the way he approached both of them had, and that was where the difference would begin to take shape. He opened the door, sitting down behind the wheel, the interior familiar, unchanged, but his posture different, more deliberate, more aware. He started the engine, the sound steady, controlled, and as he pulled out of the lot, the road ahead did not look different, but it felt different, because now he understood that every decision made on that road would carry more than just procedure. It would carry perception, and perception, if left unchecked, could lead anywhere. But if understood, if examined, it could guide something better, something clearer, something more accurate. And as he drove, the memory of that morning did not replay as a mistake to be erased, but as a moment to be carried forward, not as weight, but as direction, because change does not come from forgetting what happened. It comes from understanding why it happened, and choosing to move differently because of it. And across the base, Marcus Ellison turned away from the operations floor, the mission continuing without him needing to stand at its center. His role already fulfilled in what he had set into motion. And as he walked down the corridor, his reflection once again catching briefly in the glass, it remained steady, unchanged, because his authority had never depended on recognition from others. It had always been grounded in something deeper, something consistent, something earned over time and maintained through discipline. And the discipline, quiet as it was, had carried him through the moment that morning without disruption, without escalation, without losing clarity. Because true control is not about forcing a situation to change. It is about allowing truth to reveal itself fully. And when it does not need to be argued. It does not need to be proven. It simply stands, clear and undeniable. And miles apart, two different paths continued forward. One shaped by consistency, the other by realization, both moving into what came next, not defined by the moment that connected them, but changed by what it revealed. Because sometimes the most powerful outcome is not what happens in the moment itself, but what it leaves behind, a clearer understanding of what matters, and a quiet reminder that authority, when guided by awareness, becomes something far stronger than control alone. The road outside Maxwell Air Force Base looked exactly the same as it had that morning. Quiet, ordinary, just another stretch of pavement where cars passed without memory and moments faded without trace. But for the two men who had stood there, It was no longer just a road. It was a line, a place where something unseen had been brought into the light. And once seen, it could not be ignored again. Colonel Marcus Ellison moved through the remainder of his day with the same steady rhythm that had defined every decision he made. Each step grounded in discipline, each action guided by purpose. And as the sun began its slow descent, casting longer shadows across the base, his role shifted from command to reflection. Not because he needed to revisit the moment, but because leadership always leaves space for understanding. And in that understanding, there was no anger, no need for validation, only clarity, because he had not been defined by what happened. He had simply remained who he was throughout it. And that consistency had carried more power than any reaction ever could. Miles away, Officer Travis Cole drove the same patrol route he had taken countless times before. The familiar turns, the familiar signs, the same quiet intersections that once felt routine, but now carried a different weight. Not heavier in a way that burdened him, but clearer in a way that sharpened him. Because every glance, every decision, every moment now passed through a different lens. One shaped not by assumption, but by awareness. And that awareness did not slow him down. It refined him. It guided him. It reminded him that authority is not proven in how quickly you act, but in how clearly you see. The radio beside him remained quiet. The day moving forward without urgency, without interruption. But inside, something had shifted permanently. Something that would not fade with time or routine. Because it had been learned, not told, understood, not forced. And that kind of change does not disappear. It becomes part of how you move, how you decide, how you lead. And as the sky shifted into the softer colors of late afternoon, both men continued forward on their own paths, no longer connected by circumstance, but forever changed by what had been revealed in that single moment. Because sometimes justice does not arrive with noise. It does not demand attention or announce its presence. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the form of truth, in the clarity of recognition, in the moment when perception finally gives way to reality. And in that moment, everything changes. Because power has shifted, but because understanding has. And in the end, that is where real authority begins. Not in control, not in assumption, but in the ability to see clearly, to act accordingly, and to carry that clarity forward long after the moment has passed. Because a badge can stop a car, but only truth can change a man.